All right, everybody, so welcome back to another episode of Colton Posey Fishing. So today we're going to be talking about seasonal patterns. I'm going to break down a full seasonal pattern, all the way from winter to the next winter. I'm talking winter, spring, summer, fall, all that good stuff. But now here's the thing to understand: in the spring, you've typically got, three different things going on. You got the pre-spawn, you got the spawn, and you got the post-spawn. So we're going to go over every bit of it. We're going to keep it simple because my idea of fishing, the way that I fish, is keeping it simple. The simpler you keep it, the better and easier it's going to be for you. So either way, guys, stay tuned. This is something you don't want to miss. All right, so talking about seasonal patterns, we're going to start right now where we're at as I'm making this video. So we're in summer. We're in full-blown summer, what some people refer to as the dog days of summer, okay? This is a time of year where it's just hot and miserable for us now. But here's the thing to understand. I know a lot of people say, it's too hot, the fish won't bite. It's typically not too hot. I mean, they're in water, okay? So, they're not just burn and slap up. The main thing that the fish are looking for this time of year in the dog days of summer is good oxygenated water and bait-rich, areas. So areas where there's a lot of bait fish. But now, here's where people struggle, including myself at times. Sometimes there can be too much bait. Yeah, so when I say that, I'm not saying like, hey, there's just tons of bait everywhere and, these fish are just not going to eat because there's too much bait. It's typically not that. It's typically something to do with your presentation, and these fish are just so honed in on what they're eating. So if they're eating threadfin shad that are this large, it's really hard to mimic that. And you've got to get that down to a T. It's got to be as close as you can. That's where it comes into play when I say, if you catch a fish this time of year and you see shad in its mouth, take the shad out. Especially if the scales and stuff are not gone, so you can see the exact color, the exact size. Are they fat? Are they just little long, skinny shad? Whatever the case may be, try to mimic the color and then try your best to mimic the size. Sometimes they're just too small and you can't, and that that kind of comes into play where typically, like today, we're fishing a reservoir close to my home, and the fish up here, they're eating threadfin and they are so tiny, so it's typically hard to catch those fish because not only are the fish small, but the threadfin are small. So what we typically like to do, or what I typically like to do, I like hunting for those fish that are feeding off of crawfish. I like hunting for those fish that are feeding off of brim. And I'm typically going to do those two things kind of in the same areas, but I'm gonna be looking more to the areas that we all know and understand, as far as like your points, your main lake points, riprap close to bridges, a lot of bluff walls that are close to a creek, creeks that have run-ins in the back of it, where that way they have oxygen rich water, the water that's cooler that's coming in, areas like that. And that's the thing, this time of year, don't be afraid to go up in the creeks, okay? Don't be afraid, to go up in the creeks and fish all the way to the back, but understand why you're there. And if you start catching fish, try to figure out exactly why they're there and where you're catching them. If you're catching them off a secondary point, and then you move to another secondary point in another creek that's similar and you're not getting bit, then, something was different about that point that you were fishing, that you were catching fish off of. It could be simply just a tree stump that's down there, or it could be there's a little branch running in to that little secondary point where they have a little bit of fresh water coming in and they're just congregated around that fresh water, okay? So, paying attention to little stuff like that will help you catch a ton more fish. Never really ask, hey, don't be afraid to ask why. That's the main thing. When you start catching fish, the first thing you need to be asking is, why am I catching fish? When you ask why, and then you start putting the puzzle pieces together, you'll start catching a lot more fish and start putting a lot more puzzles together. All right, so let's move into like the next seasonal pattern that we're going to be focusing on, especially here soon, and that's fall. Fall is a great time to really catch fish because they're really feeding up for winter. They know winter's coming up and they are feeding like crazy. This is typically when you can get on the water and you'll catch, hundreds of fish. Last year, if you watched my video, Bald Fall, I caught tons. We fished maybe 2 hours and caught over 100 fish. It was just ridiculous. You wouldn't even have time really to do anything. Now, the areas you typically need to focus on, I hear a lot of people talking about going into creeks and finding the bass and the shad that are migrated into the creeks. And now I'm not saying there is not shad and bass that are migrating into the creeks, especially during the fall. But typically, I find a lot more fish on your main lake points. You're the same areas that I fish during the dog days of summer, but typically there may be little stuff going on, like if everybody's typically fishing the point, the rounded end of the point. When that point goes back and starts cutting back around on a channel bend, that is typically the area where I find these fish loaded. I mean, they will be stacked like crazy. And like I said, you can rack up on, you can catch hundreds of fish in just, a few hours time. Your jerk baits, your spinner baits, all these baits that I talk about all the time, they are typically going to come into play, especially in the fall. And you're going to be able to go and in a short amount of time rack up on a lot of fish, but focusing on, your main lake areas. But now let's say you're fishing a lake that's a lot different than mine, where like, you're fishing maybe like a Wise Lake or a Neely Henry or something like that. A lot of times you're going to have those fish on the main part of the river, but also you're going to have those fish that are pushed up in the mouths of those creeks. So what I mean by the mouths, they're not going to be in the back of the creek, but like at the first part of the creek to where you come to that, maybe that first secondary point. And a secondary point, I got this question a while back, so let me just go ahead and answer it. Besides just answering to that one person, in case you don't know what a secondary point is. A secondary point is a point inside of a creek. So when I say when you're going to fish a creek, fish that creek like it's the main lake. That's what I mean. When you go up into that creek and you see a point on your right or your left or something like that inside the creek, that is a secondary point, okay? So when you hear me referring to secondary points, that's exactly what I mean, is points inside the creeks. But either way, around your boat docks is going to be great. Anywhere that has fresh water running in, that is going to be a great area to target these fish. Now, here's the thing. They're typically going to be on a strong shad pattern in the fall, but don't be afraid to try to find and catch those fish that are eating crawfish and brim. Just because they're eating shad a lot does not mean they won't eat crawfish or they won't eat brim. It doesn't mean they won't eat crappie. Whatever type of bait you have in your lake or other fish. Okay, typically if it's big enough to fit in their mouth, they're going to eat it. So either way, fall is a very simple time and a very good time to be on the water to catch abundance of fish. It's typically not the best time to be on the water to catch your PB, but it's going to be one of the best times to be on the water to catch a lot of fish. All right, so now let's talk about one of my personal favorite times to fish besides summer, and that is winter. Winter is a time where not a whole lot of people are on the water. Most people are hunting. Most people don't want to be on the water when it's super cold, and I don't blame them. I've been on the water when, my eye guides are freezing up every time I, reel up or anything like that. So, it is a rough time to be on the water, but for individuals who may be tempted to fish during the winter and never has, I'm telling you, this is the perfect time to catch your personal best bass that you've ever caught in your life, whether it's largemouth, whether it's spotted bass, whether it's smallmouth. It doesn't really matter. This is typically going to be the time for you to get out there and catch your PB. Now, with that being said, the locations are very, very similar. I want to focus heavily on my main lake points, especially main lake points with some type of structure on it, okay? Or cover, I'm sorry, some type of cover. So I'm talking, brush piles, rocks. If you're in a spotted bass fishery, like a herring fishery, something like that, your clay banks is going to be great. Clay secondary points, but you get what I'm saying. Anywhere there's clay, brush piles that's in deep water, stumps, anything like that, anything where they have access to deep water very quickly is going to be a great area to focus on when finding these fish during the winter. Now, understanding that, we need to ask why, right? So, why would these fish want to hang out in areas that's closer to deeper water? Well, if during the day, like here in Alabama, a lot of times in the winter, our days will get up to, 60 degrees. So at night, though, it may drop all the way down to 32, 28 or something like that. So with that going on, access to shallow water quickly. They can move up as the day heats up and feed. When the shad are pushed up, or the crawfish or whatever they may be feeding on, they can move up with them and eat. And then as it cools down, they can push back out and get in that deeper water. That way they're not in that, where that surface water where, the temperature's changing and the water's changing at the same time, because it'll shock them. Okay, so but focusing on those main lake areas, creeks. When you start getting a lot of those late winter rains, when that water's trying to heat up, focus on creeks, okay? So when you have a lot of run-ins and in a creek, it doesn't matter if there's one big one in the back or like 7 throughout the entire creek. Fish every one of them. Anywhere there's a run-in, fresh water coming in, that is a great area to focus during the winter. You will catch tons of fish, but here's the thing, we're typically going to slow down. So, maybe instead, like you see me throw the 3-inch rage, or the 2.75-inch rage swimmer during the summer, during the fall and stuff like that. Well, during the winter, I'm going to go bigger, okay? So I'm going to go bigger in size, and I'm going to go lower in weight. So, during the summer and fall, I'm running the 3/8-ounce head, and then I'm running the 2.75-inch rage swimmer. During the winter, I'm going to go with a 3.75-inch rage swimmer, so almost a 4-inch profile, and then I'm going to swap down to a 1/4-ounce head. That way I can keep that bait in a specific range and slow reel that bait. Maybe I want it on bottom and I can slow tick the bottom. But either way, slowing down and really fishing out an area like your main lake points and then the creeks with the run-ins and stuff, you will catch tons more fish. So if you see the pattern going here, it's kind of like, these fish are living on the main lake during the summer. During the fall, they're kind of moving out and spreading out everywhere, just following bait fish anywhere they can. And then in the winter, they're congregating back out to that deeper water. All right, so now let's talk about the time where most people's going to be on the water. Let's talk about the pre-spawn. Okay, so this is spring. This is where it really comes in. And if you notice, I'm not talking about water temps. And it's simply because water temps doesn't always determine when these fish are moving up, okay, or moving down, or moving back, or moving left, or moving right. Water temps doesn't always have something to do with it, okay? It can be a huge factor, but a lot of times it's determined by bait movement and tons of other variables. I highly suggest, listening to Kevin Van Dam. You can Google it, and he goes into extreme detail. But there's a lot more factors than just water temp on when, the fish are going to be in the pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn mode. So with that being said, pre-spawn, this is the time when the fish are really starting to move up, and they're feeding up, and they're moving back, or moving wherever they're going to move to spawn. There's 2 things that bass always focus on. That's reproduction and food. If they can't reproduce, they're not going to survive. If they're not going to eat, then they're not going to survive either. So those are the 2 main things that they focus on heavily, and we need to focus on that with them. When I talk about moving back, you need to understand one thing that a lot of anglers doesn't talk about, and that is you have fish that live on the main lake, die on the main lake, and spawn on the main lake. And same with the creeks. You have fish that live in the creeks, die in the creeks, spawn in the creeks, okay? That is one thing that's always going to happen on a lake, okay? And a river system. You're going to have fish that live there, die there, and spawn there. So with that being said, during the spawn, or during the pre-spawn, you're going to have fish here, there, and everywhere, okay? So you're going to have fish on the main lake, you're going to have fish in the mouth of creeks, you're going to have fish moving towards the backs of the creeks. But determining which fish are the healthiest is the ones that people typically want to target, especially if you're a tournament fisherman. Now, with that being said, I typically focus on the fish closest to the main lake. Why? Because those are typically the healthiest, fattest fish. So those are the fish that I'm going to try to focus on most of the time. Now, with that being said, that does not mean the fish that have moved into the creeks are not healthy at all. You can still find fish on those secondary points, those channel bends going back up into the creeks and stuff like that, is typically just finding bait around them, okay? And even if there's not an abundance of bait, sometimes that's better, because if you have an abundance of bass and not an abundance of bait, they become a lot more competitive in my experience and from what I've seen on the lakes that I fish. So, you know, focusing on main lake and then working your way back up into creeks where these fish could be spawning. Spawning pockets are typically going to be determined. It really depends on the lake, okay? I know a lot of people say north end, but you know, when I say north end, what I mean is they say focus on northern banks. I have found in my experience that there is typically fish on the northern side, but there's also fish on the south side also, and on the east and on the west, okay? So, you know, don't throw out an area. From my experience, if it looks good, if it looks like a fish can spawn there, then more than likely they're going to spawn there. So, you know, focusing on those areas that appeal to you with your eyes, trusting your instincts. That's the hardest thing to do as an angler, is trust yourself. When you start trusting yourself, then you start making smart decisions because you trust in the process. In return, you have more confidence, especially when you're catching fish. 99% of fishing is going to be confidence. I don't think there's anybody that would disagree with that. Either way, spawn. Same thing. These fish, you're going to find fish on the main lake spawning. I have found this myself fishing a blueback herring lake with a lot of spotted bass in it. I have seen personally fish, spotted bass, move up on a main lake point, drop eggs, and then move right back out, okay? Not even sit on their bed or anything. They'll just move up, you do their thing, and then they move right back out and start feeding. It's almost an inconvenience for spotted bass to spawn, especially spotted bass in a blueback herring fishery. Now, with that being said, largemouth are different. Largemouth are really heavily focused on the spawn, and they have a real hard time spawning, okay? It's not that they have a real hard time hatching their eggs or anything. It's just they're really, really wore out after the spawn happens. So, you know, identifying beds and then, you know, putting the puzzle pieces together of, you know, do you want to fish for pre-spawn? Do you want to fish for spawn or post-spawn fish? Because you're going to have that in between during the spring. Post-spawn fish are typically going to be in those same areas that the pre-spawn fish was, and some of them still are, but you need to determine, are those fish worth catching, especially if you're tournament fishing. You know, you don't want to catch a bunch of just skinny bass that are just spawned out, and they're probably not going to live through the process. Probably, not saying that they won't, but probably not going to live through the process. So, but you know, focusing on post-spawn, spawn, or pre-spawn fish, you're going to have that kind of in between the entire time of spring. In my experience, you're just going to have to figure out which one's going to be more productive. So, either way, you know, focusing on main lake and then the move back areas, you know, like your secondary points and stuff like that, docks, any kind of cover and structure that may be in that area as you move back to where they spawn, those are typically going to be your most productive areas. And then moving back out towards the main lake, all the way in the backs of creeks, in pockets off the main lake, they're kind of here, there, and in between. You just really need to focus on, you know, hey, you know, which one do I want to catch, and then pay attention to where you're catching them, why you're catching them, and then all the puzzle pieces will fall back together, and you can mimic that pattern throughout the entire spring. So it's a really simple time to catch on and understand what these bass are doing, and then you can follow them right out to their main lake haunts. And then once you figure out their main lake haunts, you've got them throughout the fall. You can follow them back to wherever they're going in the fall, and then you can follow them back out into winter. So, you know, you kind of get this, you know, little circle that you can do that makes, you know, seasonal patterns simple, and that's what I hope to do in this video, and I hope I did. And if I did, if it helped you out any, make sure to like the video. Also subscribe if you're new here. We built a community where, you know, we're just trying to share knowledge of bass fishing. So either way, if you have any questions, with that being said, drop a comment down below. Also, we got members only. It's $2 a month. You get my content up to a week early, and you can ask your questions early, and it helps support my work. Gas, tackle, equipment, all that good stuff. If you can do it, great. If you can't, appreciate it anyways, and I'll see you next time.